welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for this show. And this is where we dig deeply into all types of topics that are really important, not just as Christians, but as responsible Christians in our society. And we do this to educate ourselves in order to have conversations that count, conversations with an eternal perspective. Now, I have a returning guest today. We're getting some incredible instruction on the Constitution. We have GR back with us, GR Mobley. If you did not see our last episode, part 3 of this series, please go back and look for episode 186 and watch that. There were so many important things in there where we can take action. And today is going to be another one of those days where GR is going to explain things to us. He is the president and head of Reclaiming the Republic, and he has a podcast, and I think it would really benefit everyone if you tuned into it every time or whenever you can. Here we go. Hi, GR.
Thanks for having me back.
Yes, thanks for being here. Okay, well, we talked about so much last time. We talked about how in order to have free will, you have to have liberty. We talked about, the true face of evil is subjugation, which is, I feel like that's the road we were headed down, between 2021 and 2025, January 20th of 2025. And then we talked about that the government doesn't produce anything. It only takes things from us. So, and a lot of other things, but I know we want to jump into, and the thing is, everyone, is GR has a real good grasp on everything going on. He is, he doesn't always agree with the mainstream of what's happening because he has a really firm grasp on the way things should be according to our Constitution. And we're going to jump into George Washington's proclamation today, unless you had something else to say first.
So believe it or not, the
floor is yours.
Yeah, so believe it or not, I actually do have a few things to say. I want to set this up, what we're going to read. But to be clear, there is no boogeyman in recent days. In other words, a lot of people like to point to Biden as doing all the bad things, or it was all Obama's fault, or Clinton. No, it was Clinton's fault, and technically,
or Bush.
So technically, what's happened over the course of the several years that we've been functioning as a nation, we've been gradually sliding down into this abyss. And so when we look at the things that Clinton got away with, well, he got away with those things because of FDR and because of Wilson, because of Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln was the first president to absolutely use the Constitution as his, what do you call that? The welcome mat in front of your door. I mean, that's pretty much what he did. He completely put aside the Constitution. And most people don't even know this because we're taught that he was this great president. And what we saw, what Lincoln did, I mean, he put people in jail. People died in jail without the right of due process or anything else. In other words, he took away people's rights, but this isn't about Lincoln. What this is about is...
But we need to learn more, not today, but that would be interesting because I've never heard that. And that kind of is, to me, it's surprising, but.
Oh yeah. So there's Lincoln had lots of real problems, but I will submit that he was divinely placed because of those problems. In other words, America needed a tyrant to get beyond somebody that was going to be just so dead set in, trying to complete something. And he started off trying to complete the wrong thing. And it wasn't until the Gettysburg Address and until the Civil War became literally about slavery is when he actually started winning wars, and he actually started winning the battles and ended up winning the war. because he prostrated himself after watching himself. I mean, it's necessary to go through real quick. Lincoln had several failures in his life, so forgive me for doing this, but he had several failures. He went into the Army as a captain and got kicked out as a private. There were all sorts of things he just failed in. And so he was hardened by the time he became president that he was no way, no how going to fail as president. And when he walked in, states started seceding and leaving the Union, and he saw himself as becoming the failed president of the United States. And that would have been, the ultimate embarrassment to basically encapsulate his whole life in nothing but failure. So he went 2 years in trying to use brute force in forcing the Union to stay together, and then finally went the right way. But even Lincoln was building upon unconstitutional overreach that was happening even years before. And so it's been a gradual process. And as Madison says, once you poke a little hole in the Constitution, I'm paraphrasing, once you poke a hole in the Constitution, the erosion will begin unless you stop and fix the Constitution, the damage done to it, not the Constitution, the problem. That through, I just want to make sure that we're all kind of looking at, we don't have boogeymen. This has been a long gradual process. So setting up this proclamation, for the first time in history, and the only time in history, both the Senate and the House were unanimous in asking and requesting the President of the United States to provide a proclamation, to tell the nation what needed to happen, now that we've got this new government. And so they requested that he actually take a day and make a proclamation of a day of Thanksgiving. Now, I think we talked about this before a little bit, that Thanksgivings were a natural thing that they did in sanctifying the blessings they've received. Coming across the ocean, they had a Thanksgiving, and they basically at the same time dedicated the land to the Lord and those types of things. And so when we read this, you're going to see that. So let's digest this a little bit at a time, line by line.
You want to pull it up?
So actually, I can. I thought you had it. So if you
I have it. Is it time to pull it up?
Yeah, go ahead and pull it up. Yes, please.
There we go.
All right. So do you want to read it, or you want me to read it? Because I'd rather you read, and then I can just read the first 2 lines, and then we can kind of talk a little bit about this.
All right.
As we go, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we have proclamation, a national Thanksgiving. Whereas you just tell me where you want me to pause. Okay.
Just go ahead and read those first 2 lines, that first stanza.
Okay. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor.
Okay. So this is kind of like a little preamble to the next kind of preamble, because the next part is where he's explaining why he's doing what he's doing. And so, but he's clearly pointing out that this is a duty. Now, when we finish this, I just want to remind me that we come back to this duty. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So go ahead and read this next whole stanza, because this right here is really coming from, why he's doing this, because again, unanimously requested by Congress to do this. Go ahead.
Wow. Okay. All right. So whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested me to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many and single favors, many and signal, is that correct? Signal
that is
favors?
Correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Signal favors, yeah.
Signal favors of Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness.
Okay, so signal means recognizable favors.
Oh, okay.
So they witnessed, Washington witnessed a lot of absolute divine, unequivocally, this was a divine hand of providence. there were several times, I think 2 or 3 times, where he was saved by fog, allowing him to escape across the bay in New York, Back Bay in Boston. I mean, it was constantly found himself in a pinch and ended up, being able to, with a blessing from the Lord. About the New York one, and actually the Back Bay one, both of them, the fog started lifting when they were finally in safe distance. And so he's just, wow. That was
by this time, had he at this point, was this before or after he found it, or if this might be a legend too, I don't know, found himself, he had bullet holes in his clothing, but he was unscathed?
I don't know about that. That probably goes to a different battle, because these fog incidents, they had no engagement with the enemy. The enemy was waiting for the fog to lift to basically attack them. And so they were in a position to attack, and they had the ability to cross. Everybody got on boats and ferried back and forth across the bay to get to the other side. And once they did, the fog lifted. And so that, I believe, is a completely different instance when they had a very close encounter and an engagement. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I've heard that there's been several for him. Which is interesting.
Okay, so these are very noticeable favors that the Lord has given them. And more importantly, the one thing that stands out is when the nation was formed, it was formed under duress, right? I mean, we could go through the Tory Acts and how they organized to petition for their rights of Englishmen. We could go through, that whole evolution of 1763 and on, where America started organizing itself in basically standing up as Englishmen, demanding their rights as members of the British Empire. And so as that continued, everybody understands the Declaration of Independence, but there were a lot of frustrating things that were occurring leading up to that point. Other than, the war and all of that was preceding. I mean, all of the impressments and everything else that they were suffering under the hands of Britain, it took them a while. I mean, they gave England several chances to do right. And how thankful I am that they were so stubborn. Those Englishmen were so stubborn, the king, parliament, and so forth, that they didn't concede and give us representation. I'm so thankful that didn't happen, because I look at England today, its monarchy and its problems, and that would be it's a sucking chest wound in the world today, because the Commonwealth of England still is still engulfed in this monarchical theocracy. Anyway, let's go ahead and read the next part.
All right.
Now, let me just go ahead, and I'll just try to interrupt you once you get to a point where I say, okay, right there, let's dive into that. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight it when I get there. Okay. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all of the good that is, or that will be.
Right
and
there. That's fine. Right there.
Okay.
So what is he asking America to do? He is asking
me?
Yes, because it's right there.
Okay.
I mean, I could ask rhetorically and then answer it, because he's asking America to give sacrifice, to serve, give service, because that's what he says, devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being. In other words, he's asking everybody to set aside one day, like the Sabbath, and do service for him. In other words, see, when we go out on the Sabbath, we to set that day aside to worship and to, commune with him and so forth. But this is a little bit different. He's asking people to take aside one day and serve him. And how do we serve him? By giving of ourselves to helping others in need. by going and doing things for people, that type of service or whatever. I mean, it could be a compassionate service. It could be actually going out and contributing or whatever. Even it could be a proselyting. But the point is that this Thanksgiving was a day of service, not of gluttony, not of football, and not of the Thanksgiving that this nation participates in today.
Yeah, it's all about me now.
Okay. But
Yeah.
okay, let's so go ahead from that semicolon on.
Okay. Get there. All right. That we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country, previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and
let me interrupt right there. So
yep.
He is basically asking people to do that one thing, in rendering a humble thanks and recognizing what has happened. Because how long was America in turmoil? I mean, going from 1763, we're now looking at 1789. That's 3 decades. And they really.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even up to that point, it was a constant battle to, get away. I mean, they had to come clear across an ocean. Then they were followed.
Sure.
But it just kind of reminds me of the CCP today.
Yes.
They follow their Chinese nationals, so they're Chinese people all the way over here.
Correct. So let's actually look at, if you look at the timeline, even up to the Constitutional Convention, there was a Shea Rebellion. The Shea Rebellion was because the people in Massachusetts and up in that quarter of the nation, they were being taxed and they couldn't afford paying the taxes. So they rebelled. They go, we didn't fight, one tyrannical, government for another. And technically, Massachusetts was slow, and most of the northeastern states were very slow in paying that debt. And so as a nation, we had not really recognized peace. We didn't really get flat-footed to where we could kind of enjoy this land from sea to shining sea until after Madison's presidency. Because after Madison's presidency, we finally had what we thought was a recognizable just an agreement with Britain, where they wouldn't impress our soldiers. They wouldn't be our sailors and so forth. I mean, we finally got to that point of peace, because up to that point, we were constantly looking over our shoulder. We knew that Britain, even though they signed the first treaty, they weren't honoring it. And so we knew that there was going to come point in time that we actually had to finish the revolution. And we still didn't finish the revolution, because Britain does not let anything go. Remember that stubbornness? I talked about that stubbornness, that they just wouldn't allow us to be Englishmen. They will not allow us to go. And if you know anybody that has any British descendancy, as born there and came here, because I know a few, and they just can't get over the fact that we got away.
That's so hard to believe, because most of us don't even think twice about it.
And they won't participate in the 4th of July festivities. They just do not like it's like we're flaunting in their face that we got away. And technically they got us back, but that's another story for another time. So go ahead. And then for the signal and manifold mercies. Okay.
Signal and manifold mercies, and the favorable interpositions of his providence in the course and conclusion of the late war.
Okay, so he's literally identifying the fact that there were recognizable mercies, and a magnitude of those mercies, or a tremendous and overwhelming amount of mercies that he provided them. And as a matter of fact, he even uses a word that we really highlight, what I do in Reclaiming the Republic. Now, that is interpositions. Most people do not know what interposition means. And interposition is taking direct action in stopping whatever's happening. In other words, if your child is getting out into the street, you rush, grab, and seize them and bring them back into safety. That's interposition. Now, there's other things like nullification. Nullification technically is ignoring the child, what the child is doing, ignoring the problem. And then there's other people that, want to, instead of cleaning the stench, they paint the walls. In other words, they do something that doesn't really solve the problem, but they feel like at least I've done something. Anyway, interposition is a direct course of action that is being applied. And so he's identifying how he was able to, by his interpositions, provide them with the conclusion of this late war. So go ahead.
Wow. Okay. The great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty, which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted.
And there it is. And particularly, the fact that they were able to create their own state what's so big about the state constitutions? The fact that the states were creating their own constitutions recognizes that they tore up the charters that established those colonies that the king did. In other words, the charter was that governing document of what this colony was obligated to do for the king. And so when we kind of look at the constitutions, that is creating a, goodbye, we're not a part of this anymore. And now we're creating our own form of governing. And so that's very important. But more importantly, that we created a constitution to completely replace this involvement of the British Empire here in this part of the world. So to me, it's important to highlight the point that he comes out and says, and particularly this national constitution. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And diffusing useful knowledge. Okay, well, it's been, let me see. Where did I finish?
So instituted. So for the civil and religious liberty, that part.
For the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all the great and various favors which he has been pleased to confer upon us. Wow.
So he really,
I think
go ahead.
Diffusing useful information, that to me is a big deal.
Yes, absolutely.
What does it mean?
So diffusing is, well, if you look, I just take what's a better way of describing it? Dispersing, spreading, disseminating.
Yes.
It's getting that information out. And
so they couldn't do it before?
Well, so the colonies were not united. Remember that each colony was its own little nation. And technically, under the Declaration of Independence and the treaty with Britain, the king had and signed a treaty recognizing each independent sovereign state. Under the Confederation, they were a confederation of states. They weren't necessarily a true union where they had this hard, and they weren't even functioning like a union, because I think I might have mentioned this before, but many of the big states were actually getting away with shenanigans. They were creating their own trade agreements when Continental Congress is supposed to do that. That was one of the big problems of why the Constitution was necessary, because the Articles of Confederation were completely impotent. It was done haphazardly, and it only got them through the war and barely past that, because once they got through the war, I might have said this before, and it's worth saying that it took about 5 years from 1777 to 1783 when that Constitution was ratified. Or I should say the Confederation of the Perpetual Union, the Confederacy. So it took 5 years for them to ratify that document, 5 years. And by the time they actually ratified it and everything else, there were 3 amendments that came in to to the Constitution or to the Articles of Confederation that they needed that they couldn't get. They already recognized that they didn't even have the authority to go requisition paper, pens, and administrative stuff so they could do their job. They had to pay out of their pocket if they needed, whatever they were using for writing utensils and so forth. And so they're going, well, we need to be able to do these things. And yeah, that makes sense. But, oh, well, it's not in that document, so you can't do it. And so it was this, I'll just say there's a good term in the Bible about a millstone around the neck. This confederation, this responsibility the Continental Congress had under that Articles of Confederation was like a millstone. They were they were heading into a, complete utter destruction if they maintained that. So they knew that they needed to change, and the change was more and more imminent because as they weren't paying their debt, there was a threat just around the corner. That threat was France. And they didn't know France was going to have this volatile revolution and that France would end up now going down this path of going, these guys over there in America, they haven't paid us anything. So if Bonaparte, when he took power, if we had not started paying them, there's no doubt in my mind he would have focused on America instead of going east and through Europe. There's no doubt.
There's has to be a balance. Yeah, right. We have to pay attention to the big picture sometimes.
Right. And in hindsight, even Madison points this out. Madison points out that had we not even had this Constitution, we would have probably been just brought into another, bevy of problems from both UK, France, and Spain. Because if I was Spain, if I was Bonaparte, I'd basically say, well, I'd be happy taking the middle section. France, you're on the south, and Canada is already British, so we'll just take these commercial states, and you can have the rest. And so they would have divided and conquered us that way. But anyway. So the other thing that's really important that he points out is he's constantly and consistently pointing to the Creator. Now, they never use the Lord or, God or any of that type of language. It's always an absolute reverence towards the Creator, the divine hand of providence. That's how they always, that was their preference. So anyway, I think it's the last paragraph. Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. Oops. Okay. And also that we may then unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions.
Wow. So you get it, right? I mean, we're always falling short, and we're stumbling as we go. But I mean, he's exuding such a spiritual attitude.
Wow.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
And
all right.
He actually understands what he's saying.
Yes.
It's the thing. He's not being told what to say.
Right.
This is coming from his heart and intellect at the same time.
Sure.
Okay. To enable us all, whether in public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually, to render our national government a blessing of all the people by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws, discreetly and faithfully executed and obeyed to protect and guide all sovereigns and nations, especially such as have shown kindness to us, and to bless them with good governments, peace, and concord, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and the increase of science among them and us, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal prosperity as he alone knows to be best.
There you go. So actually, I'm going to add just a couple of little notes here. That one of the things he points out is to protect and guide all sovereigns. What is a sovereign?
Is it the individual?
So, no.
Okay.
So a sovereign, because he says sovereigns and nations, a sovereign is a person that has ultimate say over something. Now, you can have multiple sovereigns, right?
Okay.
In other words, you can have, if let's say you're a very rich person and you create an entity that is going to do all sorts of work, and you delegate to them and empower them by delegation the ability to do everything that they need, that they don't need you to make a decision or to take action. That's a sovereign.
Okay.
Whoever has that decision capability to ultimately decide what to do. So in America, who has the decision over going to war?
Well, it's Congress, isn't it?
So Congress is sovereign over very certain things. And as a matter of fact, it's only Congress that are the sovereigns. The president is only an executive. He does not have any ability to make the decisions other than those things that Congress grants him to do, right?
Okay.
Such as being the emissary, becoming the commander in chief, and so forth. But Congress has to declare war first. Congress has to engage in the treaty. In other words, the president is dependent upon the sovereign to be able to do many of his things. And it's the same thing with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not a sovereign. In a Republican form of government, our legislative body, our representatives are our sovereigns. We, the people, are sovereigns because ultimately every 2 years or every year, we have an opportunity to decide who we want to delegate our authority to. Because that's what we're doing when we institute government, we're delegating authority to do these things, and they're sovereign in that capacity. So in other words, you may actually have, if you really start thinking about it, you may actually have several sovereigns, and technically we do. We have a state legislature that's a sovereign over those things delegated to that state. You have county supervisors. They should be sovereign over those things that are in a local nature. The real problem is that America does not understand our form of republicanism. When you look up what is a Republican form of government or republicanism, it is representation of the people. But what is the Congress representing? What does the two bodies of Congress represent? The House represents we the people. Who does the Senate represent?
They should.
No, so the Senate represents the state legislature, and this is identified in Article 5. Article 5, the very last line of Article 5 in the Constitution, says that no state without their consent shall lose their equal, or no state shall lose their equal suffrage in the Senate. Suffrage means votes, their votes, right? So when you elect a representative in Congress, you're granting him to vote for you instead of all of us having to vote on every issue. Not having a democracy, it's a representative government. So we're granting them our suffrage. So that's basically how they become a sovereign in that capacity to be able to make decisions on certain things. That being said, the Senate's the same thing, but instead of it being we the people, the Senate is still bound to representing that state legislature. Now, everybody thinks today that doesn't apply, but actually it does. That part of the Constitution, Article 5, that says, provided that no amendment be passed, that actually, I'm going to pull it up, and that way I can read it.
All right.
See here. Let me see. Color-coded Constitution. And if you don't have your copy, you definitely want to get yours. So anyway.
Now you sent me one. So
yes.
Should people can get it on your website?
Yeah, it's on the Constitutional Articles page. Yeah.
Okay. Let me put that back up there.
So this is Article 5, and Article 5 is the amendment process. And so the very first part of Article 5 is the process of how to amend the Constitution. The last part of it is this little, what we call the Amendment Protection Clause. And there are two amendments that cannot be passed. And one of them was to end the slave trade, because that's the very first thing. provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the ninth section of the first article. So what that means is, provided that there's no amendment to this Constitution that will basically take away the end of the slave trade. That was a part of the condition of the compromise on slavery, that they got to have the importation of slaves. For 20 years, they could import people. I'm going to go down a little rat hole. Okay. Where does the authority of immigration lie in the Constitution?
Is it there?
So actually it's not, because the authority for immigration was the states. The states, when people immigrated to America, they weren't immigrating to the seat of government.
No.
They had no place there. They had to immigrate into the states. They had to, we want to buy land, or we want to become a farmer, or we want to do something. We just want to be free and work for somebody. Whatever the reason was, they had to immigrate to states. So states actually managed for the first century plus their own immigration. It wasn't until we actually had an overflow of immigrants pouring into America where the federal government said, hey, you know what? We're going to manage this for you. And the states let them do it.
Okay.
And now look at what they're doing. They're actually controlling and bringing people in, like the refugees coming into the United States. They don't have the authority to do that. They don't have the authority to just allow the borders to be open.
Right.
Right. They don't have the authority to be involved in any of it, because that's the danger when you allow government to assume powers not delegated. And so, bottom line, let me get to this last part.
So wait.
Okay.
GR, before we move forward, so is it okay for states to say, oh, well, we're sanctuary states and we're just going to harbor these people?
So no, because the Constitution demands that any invader be repelled. That's right here in Article 1, Section 8. It says, whenever there's an invasion, and an invasion, it doesn't matter. When they talked about this invasion clause in the Constitution calling forth the militia, because that's what it is. It's in the militia clause. It says, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That right there is the extent of the reasons that we are to form a national army. Now, if that didn't make sense, because nobody usually gets this, we do not have constitutional authority to call forth little Johnny and Sally and put them into a uniform, train them, and ship them overseas to fight a war. Remember, what they just said here is this is the only three reasons to pull forth the militia to create a federalized army. It is for providing for the execution of the laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Is any of that have any to do with foreign nations at all? Those are all internal problems.
Yeah,
people
those are all.
People out, right? Okay, so there's no reason defined in the Constitution that grants the federal government the ability to deploy our children around the world. The only place in the Constitution and the only force that has that responsibility of being forward deployed or going through the world is right here in the, let me see here, the two above it, to provide and maintain a navy. That was the external defense mechanism to protect us from abroad. So it's supposed to go out and be able to fight the wars in the open seas, or even go on the foreign shores and fight. The army is not. Does that make sense?
It does right now. I mean, the way you're saying it. So what about the other services? Like you have the Marines and you have.
Okay. So the Marines is a part, because I'm a Marine. And the Marines are they're part of the Navy. They're in the Navy department, right?
Okay.
And so the Marines and the Navy is our external war fighting force, period. Anything outside of the boundaries of the United States depends upon the Navy and the Marine Corps to fight. And the fact that they got all these branches, because what ended up happening by creating a standing army, They created this opportunity to have more general officers. So when they created the Air Force and divided the Army from the Army Air Guard and the ground forces, they said, okay, now we have a United States Air Force. That gave more opportunity for more officer positions to actually make generals and admirals and so forth. And it's the same thing with the Space Force. It's all about bureaucracy. It's about being able to, create more opportunity of manpower for people to manage so that people can get their leadership and these, I'll just say, these advancements in careers. If you really kept it down to the way it's supposed to be, we wouldn't need all these bureaucracies. But what you're not going to find out of DOGE that's happening right now is they're not going to even address these things. They're not addressing the Constitution. Now they're chasing the money. Everybody loves that. But if you don't,
not everybody.
But the point is, it goes back to what I was saying. The real problem is the stench in the room. Something's causing that. And what DOGE is doing is, well, they're putting fresh paint on the walls. And so it looks better. And it's a little bit better, but it's not getting to the source of the problem. The source of the problem is the federal government has done so many things that violate this Constitution, which is why we have the color-coded Constitution. So people can start seeing this and going, how is this being violated, this militia clause? Back to the invasion, though, okay? That last part, repelling invasions. When they talked about this in the ratification debates, they were very clear that an invading force was not just combatants. They knew, because they were seeing it in Europe, because the annals of history have even proven this, that you can be invaded by a culture, by a mass migration. Oh, by the way, that actually happens to be an Islamic, help me out here, an Islamic doctrine. And I forget that it's in one of our it's in petition 3. I could look it up, but I'm bad with names, but there's actually a doctrine of culturally taking over a nation through immigration and having lots of births, which is one of the things that Islam, that's why they have multiple marriages and so forth. They overwhelm you with, bodies to actually take over by using democracy. So it says this, that they're to repel, right? They're to repel invasions, but the real kick comes in Article 4, Section 4. And this Article 4, Section 4 is the guarantee clause. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Most people remember this. They go, oh, we're supposed to have a republican form of government. They forget this last part because that's a comma, not a semicolon. And it says the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. Is there any questions as to what we're supposed to do? They're to be repelled. They're not to be kept here, due process. They're not guaranteed any due process. No citizen has, if you're not a citizen, you have no privileges and immunities guaranteed to you. That is only U.S. citizens. So people that go down the path of giving up their citizenship, they don't have any rights to be, getting due process, habeas corpus, writ of habeas corpus, any of these things. They've surrendered their access to that protection. And so back to this amendment protection clause, though, Article 5. So we talked about the ending of the slave trade, but this is the last part of this. Provided that no amendment which shall be made, ... that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So that right there guarantees that the state's legislatures will maintain suffrage in the Senate. Their vote, in other words, those senators are to vote according to their will. Now, when we look at a representative of 1 to 30,000, that's we're supposed to have, not 1 to 1 million, what we have. But when we look at 1 to 30,000, that still is a lot of people that one representative in the House of Representatives represents. And so when we go, how, if you're the representative, how am I going to vote? Well, I would probably want to vote by consensus, because if the majority of people want this, then that's my job, is to do that, because I'm here to provide suffrage for them. nine times out of 10, if they're Democrat, Republican, or actually I should say progressive, because they're not representing anybody. They're basically inflicting their will. They don't even care what anybody wants. They're there to do a job. They're there to drive this nation into the gutter.
Yeah.
But the state, now we're talking about the state legislature. The state legislature could actually and has the authority to succinctly say, we've taken it into consideration and we're now telling you, Mr. and Mrs. Senators, because you may have whatever they are, right? You now have to vote on this particular treaty against it. They can literally tell them to vote against it. The state legislatures. This is really important. And
yeah, it is.
When you look at the representation of the state, I'll give you two cases. Arizona is a red state. In other words, the state legislature is Republican and very conservative. Their two senators, guess what, are Democrats.
Yeah.
And they vote Democrat. The state of Arizona could literally reach out and say, you can't vote that way anymore. And if you do, you deny us our suffrage, because it's right here in the Constitution that no state without its consent shall be deprived. And they never gave consent. What's happened is the 17th Amendment literally created a condition, because everybody thinks, well, they're not being elected by or appointed by the state legislature. They don't have to represent them anymore. Now, this may be something that we could really dive into, because I think most people don't understand this, but this goes down to sovereignty. When we create a government, it is a sovereign, and the Constitution recognized that sovereignty and that suffrage for that sovereign, which is why it's in the Amendment Protection Clause. The reason is because when the big states were coming into the Constitutional Convention, they wanted to basically change everything that would have empowered them, and the small states would have been destroyed. The small states would have been nothing to them. And so when they were trying to, get everybody, the big states said, well, why don't we have this advantage of having representation based on people only? And the little state said, there's just no way. We will not be a part of this union if you're going to do that, because we want to protect our sovereignty. We want to protect our culture, because each of these states had actually different focuses. There were a few of the states religiously that were non-denominational, and most of them were small states. In other words, they were Christian, but they didn't have necessarily a Christian direct affiliation. 8 of the states absolutely had, and they were giving stipends to. But the fact of the matter is they were all Christian, but there were a few that were very open, and they tolerated all Christianity, and only Christianity. As a matter of fact, Jews weren't even allowed to practice in those states either.
Wow.
I think there's only 1 or 2 states that actually allowed Jews to openly practice. And that didn't happen until much later, towards the revolution. So, so we were very, very guarded. We were very pig-headed. We were very, okay, it's only our religion in the state, and that's it. Well, we've really opened up to allow this concept of this freedom of religion, because the Constitution kind of forced that. But the fact of the matter is when you look at each state having suffrage, that's protected in Article 5. When you read the 17th Amendment, we don't have to do a special on it, but when you read the 17th Amendment, it only changed how senators were to be appointed. They, instead of being appointed by the legislature, they were appointed by election of the people, and how they were replaced. In other words, they were replaced by the governor and via an election. And so that's the only thing the 17th Amendment did. It didn't say that the states were going to lose their suffrage. And as a matter of fact, had it said that, somebody could have gone into Article 5 and said, hey, hold on here. You can't pass an amendment that is going to deny these states their equal suffrage.
Well, that's what's happened today, as you say,
so
in Arizona and other states. I was surprised to see what happened from a senator from Texas.
Yes.
During the State of the Union.
Right.
It's like, what?
So bottom line, when we look at this right here, and you look at the 17th Amendment, what ended up happening is everybody told the senators, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry. You don't represent them anymore. And that's when it shifted from who they represented, because it took a little while. It took for some of these old dogs to die. And then once everybody died, the globalists assumed full control over that Senate. Now,
okay, can you define, because not everybody understands when we say the globalists are doing this, they're doing that, they're doing the other. And I want to really start narrowing down on that, not on this show right now, but I think it's important. People need to understand that there's an entity out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's layers to that entity.
Yes,
and
there are.
The base entity is one that would absolutely surprise you, because they're not recognizable billionaires. These people are, they have such an incredible access to almost all the wealth of the world. And so they're the ones that are actually pushing, and everything's happening because of their will, or I should say Satan's will, to assume full control. So when we talk about globalists, the globalists are usually what we see as the bankers and the corporations that are pouring money in, because you'll never actually see that small little circle of trust directly contributing in these elections. And even you'll never even hear them talk about what what government should be doing. That happens in closed doors, like the Bilderberger meetings and those types of things, where they're very closed doored and they do all sorts of just disgusting, evil things, and their intent is evil. So when we look at the globalists, these are puppets that we see that are the globalists who are actually funneling money into these campaigns. And these are huge PACs, they're corporations, banks, and so forth, that are driving financial support to make sure that those people who will be accountable to them get into office. Now, everybody has seen in the past decade, or maybe 15 years, we've all seen what happened in Georgia twice, where in a Senate race, we actually saw how money came out of California, companies out of California and so forth, not in Georgia, that poured money into these runoff campaigns to actually ensure that the globalists, the Democrats, won. And so that right there, if that isn't evidence enough, and that's another state, we have 2 Democrats in Georgia where you have a hard, dark red Republican legislature, and they're not demanding their suffrage in the equal Senate. If you lay it out and you actually look at all the red states and how many senators are Democrats and or not Republican, like Maine, I think there's Senator Snow or whatever her name is. And I think same thing with Alaska. When you look at some of these senators, they vote both ways. And sometimes they claim to be independent. But it doesn't matter what their party affiliation is. It has no bearing on what they do. They're there as proxy agents for that state legislature. In other words, that state legislature tells them, you will vote this way. You better vote that way, because if not, and you deny them that suffrage on an issue, then the state can actually pull them back. But they need certain laws, and they need to actually enforce the supreme law of the land. But they can do this. And I'm trying to have meetings with state legislatures specifically about this, because just imagine if all of a sudden the state legislatures seized full control over that Senate and wiped out the century of work that the globalists have taken in stealing that vestige of power from us, because that's where treaties are made. That's where advice and consent is given to Supreme Court justices, executive parts of the executive branch, and so forth. It is a very critical part of our government. Yeah. If we actually had the state legislatures take control, it just cuts those chains completely. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's a good place to stop, because I'm sure some people's heads are spinning and others are, that is to me really important. And my mind is going, okay, it's thinking, what can be done? If you're in a state that is basically conservative, and why is this important? It's important because if you don't have elected officials that actually believe in God, and that they are held accountable, like we saw in the letter, the Thanksgiving proclamation from George Washington.
Right.
When we laid everything down, why we've been prosperous as a nation because of God and his blessings on us, because we recognized and invited him to help us and begged him. And what GR is saying is these globalists, and maybe we can, I know that Dr. David Martin put up 12 names of the most powerful, some of the most powerful people in the world that people never heard of.
Right.
These are people you never hear about.
Right.
The only one that I recognized was Yo-Yo Ma, which really surprised me. I was like, what? So yes, and they are not God-fearers. That's why this is important. And they do disgusting, demonic things behind the scenes.
Yep.
And either you want to be ruled by people who are just people, but they recognize God and a creator, or you want to be ruled by demonic, influenced individuals.
Right.
Who will stop at nothing to wipe out your whole family in a blink of an eye. It will mean nothing to them.
So I have several state legislators' emails. This takes a lot of time to do. And I need to get these out, but if somebody, hint, hint, could get me the Virginia State Legislature's email addresses, and I can send you how I do it, because it's just literally their email address, semicolon, space, email address. So it is literally a listing, because I have the ability to send out an email to hundreds of people because from my domain. And most people, if you use Gmail and so forth, you try to go over a certain number and they consider you spamming people, and they'll slap you down, because that's what the globalists are doing. They're keeping us from talking and spreading the word.
And that's why I love that letter, because it says disseminating knowledge.
Yes.
And we are really being held back from that.
Yes.
In our day.
Today, I believe that most of the people that are involved in their churches and so forth don't have much hope with their government. They have all their hope, based and founded on our Creator and his coming and his benevolence. I'm here to tell you that you can find hope in the Constitution, that the Constitution truly gives us everything we need to take this government back. We do not need a revolution. All we need to do is enforce it, literally holding our public servants accountable, and it has to start at your county level. Yeah. Because until you take your county back, you'll never get any leeway with your state. And this is why we do what we do. And I have mentoring meetings with gentlemen that you've talked to, where we, meet on a weekly basis, talking about the game plan, what to do, and so forth. And moving petitions, interposition. Remember that word, interposition. Petitions are interpositions, because petition basically calls out a public servant, your county legislators, calls them out and says, hey, you've got a constitutional duty to do something. And so therefore, we can talk about the 17th Amendment. We can talk about lots of things, but I know we've run out of time. So let's figure out what we want to talk about as we move forward. I'm here to help.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with the 17th Amendment next time.
Okay.
And I'm going to write that down to just remind myself.
And you can add the 16th Amendment too, because the 16th Amendment is another violation of the Constitution as well. Okay.
Just tell people real quickly where they can find your stuff, and maybe start joining in some of these group meetings.
Reclaimingtherepublic.org. It's right there scrolling by. I have a contact page, the easiest thing to do, and I don't have email listings that I send out to, membership or anything else. The only people I bombard with emails are your legislators. I would do it to county commissioners, but getting that list is even more overwhelming. So anyway, if you send me an email, or if you give me a call, because I have the contact information on my contact page, I will respond. I will get back to you. If not me, if you're from Virginia, it may be easier for me to have Woody call, a guy by the name of Woody who's in Virginia. And so anyway, all right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you once again. This was just, whoo, my head just kind of explodes with like, okay. There's so much. I always take notes when you're talking. So thank you again. And we will set up another time and keep educating people on what they can do while we have this opportunity.
No problem. No problem. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe.
All right. God bless.